Have you ever walked into a room filled with noise, voices speaking, people moving, but somehow something still feels missing? Not silence, not sound, but thought. That eerie stillness beneath the surface, where everyone is moving, reacting, shouting, but no one is truly thinking. There is nothing more frightening than ignorance in action. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. We like to think stupidity is about low IQ, a lack of education, or being uninformed. But what if that's not the real danger? What if the most terrifying kind of stupidity comes not from the mind that can't think, but from the mind that simply chooses not to? Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a man who lived and died through one of humanity's darkest chapters, believed exactly that. From a prison cell in Nazi Germany, he wrote something almost prophetic. Against stupidity, we are defenseless. Not because stupidity is more powerful than truth, but because once it takes hold, reason no longer matters. Facts become noise, logic is laughed at. And the most dangerous part? The person acting in stupidity believes they're doing good. This isn't just history. It's not just politics. It's something we're all living through, right now. Think about it. A well-educated friend shares a conspiracy theory online without checking a single source. A loving parent refuses life-saving science, convinced they're protecting their child. A group of bright students chant slogans they've never questioned, convinced they are standing for truth. These aren't stupid people, but they've stopped thinking, and the world pays the price for their surrender. Bonhoeffer didn't just diagnose stupidity as ignorance, he saw it as surrender, a moral failure. And in a world filled with noise, this quiet surrender of thought may be the very thing unraveling us from within. So the real question isn't, who is stupid? It's, when does stupidity begin? And even more unsettling, could it be happening to you? You don't wake up one day and decide to stop thinking. It doesn't happen in a loud moment. It happens quietly, like erosion. First, you feel tired. Too many headlines, too many arguments, too many opinions flying past your screen. You start skipping the details, trusting the headline instead. You stop asking questions, not because you're lazy, but because it feels safer. This is how the surrender begins. Not with hatred, but with exhaustion. Bonhoeffer saw it with chilling clarity. He watched professors, theologians, and intellectuals, people who once taught critical thinking, fall silent. He watched educated citizens nod along with ideas they once would have debated fiercely. He saw their minds retreat, not because they lacked intelligence, but because the price of thinking had become too high. They were tired of standing alone, tired of being the only voice of dissent in a room that demanded obedience. And so they stopped. Not suddenly, but gradually, until one day they weren't thinking at all. They were just repeating what the party said, what the crowd believed, what the algorithm showed them. And Bonhoeffer realized something terrifying. When a person surrenders their capacity for independent judgment, they aren't just uninformed, they're no longer truly themselves. You don't reason with someone in that state. You can't debate with a slogan. You can't argue with a catchphrase that's been repeated until it becomes truth, because the person is no longer present. This, Bonhoeffer wrote, is what makes stupidity more dangerous than evil. Evil knows it's doing wrong. Stupidity thinks it's doing good. You can resist evil. You can fight it, expose it, outlast it. But stupidity moves like fog. It doesn't confront you. It seduces you. It tells you thinking is too hard, that everyone else already knows the truth, that questions are dangerous, and silence is safe. And if you listen long enough, it starts to sound like wisdom. That's when the surrender is complete. It's easy to imagine it as a personal flaw, a failure of the individual. But Bonhoeffer saw deeper. He recognized that stupidity isn't born in isolation. It grows in groups, in systems, in culture. He called it a sociological sickness, a collective condition that arises when people stop thinking together. History backs him up. In the 1950s, psychologist Solomon Asch demonstrated how easily people conform. He placed subjects in a room where everyone gave the wrong answer to an obvious question, like which line is the longest. Even when the answer was clear, 75% of participants gave in to the group at least once. They knew the truth, but they chose agreement over accuracy. Now imagine that experiment scaled up, digitized, weaponized. That's where we are today. Social media doesn't just connect people, it synchronizes their thinking. Algorithms reward certainty, not curiosity. outrage, not nuance. It's no longer about truth, it's about what gets shared. False information spreads 6 times faster than truth, not because people are malicious, but because the lie feels better. It's simpler, more satisfying, easier to digest, and slowly, without even realizing it, people trade in their critical faculties for emotional comfort. Bonhoeffer warned us, the fact that the stupid person is often stubborn must not blind us to the fact that he is not independent. In conversation with him, one feels that one is not dealing with a person, but slogans and catchwords that have taken possession. He wasn't speaking in metaphor. He was describing a real transformation, one where a human being, capable of thought, of empathy, of growth, becomes a carrier of someone else's ideas without knowing it. They stop thinking, not because they can't, but because thinking costs more than repeating. And so stupidity begins to look like confidence, like certainty, like leadership, but underneath is a hollow center. No questions, no curiosity, no courage. This is the rise of functional stupidity. And it doesn't look like chaos, it looks like order. A well-aligned crowd moving in one direction, unaware that no one is steering. We assume intelligence protects us. We believe that education, credentials, and experience are shields against foolishness. But history tells a different story. Bonhoeffer saw lawyers, doctors, engineers, people trained to think critically, turn into enablers of cruelty. Not because they suddenly became evil, but because they stopped thinking for themselves. They followed rules, they followed orders, they followed crowds. Intelligence is not immunity. In fact, sometimes it's a trap. Because the smarter you are, the better you become at rationalizing, at twisting logic to defend what you want to believe, at building walls around your comfort, not bridges to the truth. This is the dark irony. Stupidity doesn't always wear a blank stare. Sometimes it wears a suit, holds a degree, sits in a boardroom or teaches in a university. And that's when it becomes most dangerous, when it hides behind the illusion of competence. Psychologists call it cognitive dissonance, the moment when the mind is confronted with a truth that threatens its identity. Rather than adjust the belief, most people reject the truth. They double down, they explain it away. They turn inward, not to reflect, but to defend. And in a society where speed is everything, where reaction is rewarded more than reflection, that defensive reflex becomes the norm. Bonhoeffer understood this decades before neuroscience caught up. He saw that when pressure mounts, social, political, or emotional, even the brightest minds can bend. Not out of fear, but out of fatigue. It's exhausting to hold complex, contradictory truths. It's easier to hold a single slogan, and so intelligence becomes a liability when it lacks humility. When it forgets that being smart doesn't mean being right. When it refuses to be questioned, because questioning feels like weakness. But the Stoics taught us the opposite, that the wise man is not the one who knows the most, but the one who is most willing to examine himself, to be wrong, to change. Bonhoeffer paid the ultimate price for holding on to that willingness, not because he had all the answers, but because he refused to stop asking questions. If stupidity thrives in chaos, it is perfected in systems, not by design, but by neglect. Bonhoeffer observed this chilling truth. It wasn't just propaganda that blinded people. It was structure, a system that rewarded obedience and punished reflection, a world where asking hard questions made you dangerous, where silence became the safest option. And what was true in 1940s Germany echoes louder today. Our economic systems don't value thought, they value output, speed, reaction. Social media monetizes attention, not understanding. News thrives on outrage, not nuance. Politics rewards simplicity, not complexity. And so the system teaches us to move fast and think shallow, to feel more and reflect less, to scroll, react, share, and never stop to ask, is this true? We call it rational ignorance. Because when life is a struggle, when you're working 2 jobs, raising children, drowning in noise, critical thinking becomes a luxury. It's not that people want to surrender their minds. It's that the system makes thinking expensive and emotional reaction cheap. Bonhoeffer didn't have the language of algorithms or dopamine loops, but he understood the deeper mechanism, that when thinking becomes difficult, people will reach for what is easy. And systems that exploit that tendency, whether political, technological, or economic, are not just enabling stupidity, they are manufacturing it. We're not just fighting misinformation, We're fighting exhaustion, overload, a slow grinding pressure that dulls our minds and weakens our will. And the result? A world where emotional certainty replaces moral courage, where complexity is seen as suspicious, where the loudest voice is mistaken for the clearest truth. This is how civilizations drift, not into madness, but into mediocrity. Not with screams, but with shrugs. The Stoics warned against this long ago. They taught that the mind must be trained, like a muscle. That to see clearly, we must resist the easy path. That truth requires effort, and freedom demands responsibility. Bonhoeffer echoed this in his prison letters. He believed that real thinking, honest, independent thought was an act of moral resistance, not just against governments or ideologies, but against the slow decay of the soul. And today, that resistance is needed more than ever. So how do we resist? Bonhoeffer believed that thinking, truly thinking, was not a passive habit. It was a form of courage. He called it costly grace. The willingness to stand alone in thought, even when the crowd marches the other way. The strength to ask questions that might make you unpopular. The discipline to doubt yourself, not because you lack confidence, but because you value truth more than pride. This is the courage to think. And it's not grand. It's not public. It doesn't come with applause. It shows up in small moments. When you pause before sharing something online. When you read something that offends you and still finish it. When you ask yourself, what if I'm wrong, and actually want to know the answer? These aren't acts of brilliance. They're acts of bravery. Psychologists now call this intellectual humility. It's the quiet admission that we don't know everything, that we are always vulnerable to bias, always susceptible to comfort masquerading as conviction. And in a world of curated certainty, that humility becomes radical. Imagine if every week you read an article you disagreed with on purpose, not to confirm your views, but to challenge them, to see if they can withstand pressure, to keep your mind from growing soft with repetition. Or what if you practice saying, I don't know, without shame, without pretending, without spinning your ignorance into a stronger opinion? In a culture obsessed with having the answer, admitting uncertainty becomes an act of resistance. The Stoics knew this long before it was fashionable. They taught that the wise man doesn't cling to beliefs like armor. He holds them loosely, examining them constantly, like tools in need of sharpening. And Bonhoeffer embodied that Stoic spirit. Even as the world around him grew darker, he never surrendered the light of thought. He asked questions. He challenged assumptions. He chose discomfort over delusion. And in doing so, he proved something timeless. That real courage doesn't always fight with fists or flags. Sometimes it fights with questions, with quiet reflection, with the choice to keep thinking when everyone else has stopped. Every day, we're offered a choice to think or to follow, to question or to comply, to protect our inner clarity or to trade it for the comfort of noise. Bonhoeffer's final question wasn't philosophical. It was personal, urgent, direct. Who stands fast? Not who speaks the loudest, not who is the smartest, but who stands fast when the cost of thinking becomes unbearable. This isn't a question for history books. It's a question for you, because the greatest threats to truth no longer march in uniform. They whisper through headlines. They slide through feeds. They come dressed in certainty, bathed in urgency, sold as common sense. And resisting them doesn't require revolution. It requires discipline. To pause before reacting, to verify before believing, to listen longer than you're comfortable, to ask questions even when you fear the answers. The Stoics called this self-leadership, an inner alignment, a life of quiet strength that doesn't need applause to be true. Bonhoeffer lived that life. He died for it. He was hanged in April 1945, just weeks before the war ended. His last words spoken to a fellow prisoner were simple. This is the end, for me, the beginning of life. He never stopped thinking, even as the world collapsed around him, even when thinking meant death. And that's what makes his legacy eternal. Not his writings, not his martyrdom, but his refusal to surrender the mind. In a world that profits from our thoughtlessness, every quiet act of reflection becomes resistance. Every honest doubt becomes armor. Every effort to understand, deeply, painfully, fully, becomes a spark against the dark. So here is the final challenge. This week, take one belief you hold tightly, something you think is obviously true, and spend 30 minutes exploring the arguments against it. Not to change your mind, but to strengthen your mind. If it survives, you'll own it with more depth. If it doesn't, you'll have grown. Bonhoeffer's warning wasn't just about Nazi Germany. It was about us, today, now. Because functional stupidity doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, whispering that you already know everything you need to know, that you don't need to ask, that you don't need to think. But you do, because thought is the last line of defense and the first step toward a better world. So the question remains, not for them, for you.